I spent the first 3 weeks of my maternity leave sitting in the NICU of Children's Hospital in Dallas. That is not how I expected to spend that time. Though the surgery that had saved my son's life had taken place when he was only 3 days old, we spent weeks away from our home in Waco, waiting for him to heal. It's not much comfort when the rounds of doctors and nurses says, this is Gareth, and he's only got one problem. He's the healthiest baby here. I became intimately acquainted with the architecture of the NICU floor. I could walk that place in my sleep even now. I walked back and forth from the waiting room to my son's room with a new guest who would come and visit every day. Every 3 hours, I used the industrial-grade breast pump to keep my milk supply up, and I remember being a little proud that I could get 5 ounces on his 3rd day of life. I left that place 3 weeks later with a cooler full of breast milk. I guess I won that. Sometimes I slept on the bed in my son's room. It was just actually a couch. It wasn't really a bed. But mostly I slept at the Ronald McDonald House, less than a mile away from the hospital. Now, I didn't know much about the Ronald McDonald houses before that. I only knew it was a thing because when you went to McDonald's for lunch or French fries or like at 11:30 at night when you were a college student, they had those like boxes that you could drop money into. But during those 3 weeks, I learned what Ronald McDonald houses do. They provide hotel-like accommodations for families in crisis for almost no money. We paid $100 a week for full accommodations, including laundry. They also arrange for families to have 3 meals a day, no charge. I'm not talking like cold cereal, sandwiches. I'm talking hot meals every day. A church group or a business or an intramural football team or a gaggle of grandmas, who knows what, would roll in with hot food, breakfast, lunch, or dinner for a room full of strangers like me. They couldn't heal our babies. They couldn't put our lives back together. All they could do was feed us. And that's what they did. Day after day after day, all 3 weeks, I was there. There's a lot of feeding stories in the Bible because it's a primal need. Anybody who's had a small child who's hungry knows that. And our scripture this morning takes place just days after Jesus has fed thousands of people, 5 loaves of barley bread, 2 fish. The folks who ate that bread had actually come looking for Jesus, tracking him down by boat until they find him in Capernaum on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Whatever Jesus did, apparently he was a great cook. These are really determined people, and they're perplexed. Why has Jesus run away from the crowds who need to be fed? And what follows is a pretty amazing conversation about what we crave from God and what we actually need from God. I think Jesus is being kind of tacky here. These people have gone to a lot of trouble to find him, and he's like, you're just looking for me because I made you lunch. You missed it, that it was more than just bread. And they come back at him with the story of Exodus that Lonnie read for us earlier, when God sent manna, which literally means, what is that? Heavenly bread from the skies to feed Israelites every day for 40 years. They seem to believe that Jesus' miracles of the fishes and the loaves, this abundance, is a repetition of a long-ago miracle. That just as God sustained Israel in the desert every day for generations, they're expecting Jesus to feed them every day with literal food. I mean, he was the Messiah after all. He was going to lead them, and in this time, in this political and social and economic system, it was the responsibility of leaders to make sure people are fed. That's why we joke that Rome was about bread and circuses. Obviously, this is a story of misunderstandings. That people don't realize that this is Jesus. He can heal their babies. He can piece their lives back together. He can do more than just feed them bread, but all they imagine that they need from him is lunch. And to his credit, He does feed them, even though they don't understand him. Which is just another indication that God knows our needs and has a history of meeting them even when we are asking too little from him. God would much rather meet our more complex needs, but even thinking about our complex needs is daunting. That's been one of my most disheartening parts of being an adult, is the realization that the woes of the world are deeply complex all the way down. You don't just eliminate poverty by raising wages. You raise wages and you provide health care and you make child care affordable and you fully fund public schools and. You don't just eliminate racism by supporting affirmative action. You penalize banks for redlining and you pay reparations for the descendants of slaves and you elevate the voices and experiences of people of color and you enact cultural shaming for ethnostatists and. And you certainly don't solve food insecurity by merely handing out sack lunches and financially supporting food banks like we do. But there's something to be said for doing things like Jesus did. He wanted to heal people's souls, but he also healed their bodies. He wanted the people to crave eternal bread, but he also fed them literal bread. He knew that these physical miracles were limited in their scope, were not really the point, but he didn't stop doing them. He didn't stop feeding them and healing them and casting out their demons and preaching on mountains and valleys just because they were short-term solutions to long-term problems. Churches can get so wrapped up in the spiritual warfare at hand that we forget that there are simple, pragmatic battles at hand. There are people who, like right now, at this very moment, are hungry, and we can feed them. Who, like me, all those years ago in a Ronald McDonald House, we know that the food is not going to solve all of our problems. But sometimes the food is enough, because a full belly is what gave me the energy to focus greater attention on my son's healing. And especially helped that I didn't have to cook that food. I resent every day that I still have to cook food. So like Jesus, the church actually does need to be in the business of meeting immediate physical needs within our communities. That's a real calling for us, but we've got to keep in mind that the deeper calling alongside that is ultimately to meet needs beyond the physical. We're called to the short game and the long game. We're not just in the business of bread, we're in the kitchen where the bread of life is actually made. It's one of those ubiquitous points now that schools provide free lunches and breakfasts to students who come from low-income families, and in a lot of places they just provide breakfast and lunch to any kid in any school. And the studies that I've seen about it all agree that the more access to food a kid has and the healthier that food is, the better their test scores are. And I resent the fact that it's what test scores is what tells us we should feed children. I think that you should give children food whether or not they test well on anything. But just feeding kids is not enough. For many children, there are compounding family and cultural circumstances, including systemic racism, that make it hard for them to succeed. Which is why this story, this is like the one sports reference I make in a year, okay? This LeBron James's new school. Have you heard about this? I have my own personal reservations about trusting billionaires and millionaires to fix our systemic cultural problems. I'm just going to give thanks, though, at this point right now, okay? LeBron James, a very, very, very good basketball player from what I understand, in cooperation with the school district of Akron, Ohio, is personally funding a school called I Promise. Just opened. It's got 240 at-risk 3rd and 4th graders in it. Eventually, it'll be a school that goes all the way up, but right now they're starting small. And these students receive free tuition, free uniforms, free breakfast, free lunch, free snacks, free transportation within 2 miles, free bicycle and helmet, access to a food pantry for the whole family, and guaranteed tuition for all graduates to the University of Akron. And even more remarkable, the parents of students will receive job placement services and help getting their own GEDs. LeBron, somewhere along the way, learned that we can't just feed people if we want to improve our neighbors' lives. To change a life, for both child and parent, for a community, requires commitment of resources on a large scale to change systems which otherwise doom people to failure. LeBron James didn't just want these kids fed, which is a good thing to want kids to do. He wanted to contribute to saving his community, to give his people a better future. That is a very Jesus thing to do. For all his mysterious parables, and he has a lot of them, Jesus is actually a very good teacher. Especially in this instance, this dialogue where he stays with a story that his audience brings up. He's trying to teach them about the bread of life, and they're like, well, what about the manna, Jesus? And he's like, all right, let's talk about manna. Remember that Israel had barely escaped the clutches of their oppressive Egyptian masters when they found themselves wandering towards Sinai without travel rations. Imagine you're hungry, and 100,000 of your other neighbors are hungry, and none of you have food. That's a problem. They're immediately fearful and angry, and they blame Moses. Why couldn't we just stayed in Egypt where there was meat and bread? I know we were slaves, but now we're going to starve to death out here. And God starts providing them heavenly bread. At night, flocks of quail fly over and die instantly at their feet so they can have meat, and every morning they wake up and there's bread on the ground. This is important to note, and I don't think we talk about it enough. No one could ever collect more of the manna than they needed. Every family learned to harvest just what they needed for that day, because otherwise the hoarded rations would rot immediately. The kingdom of God imagines a future where abundance is enough. That's what we all need. We don't need more. We need enough. In the divine economy, it was critical that folks understood that provision, that life itself would be tended and provided by God, and that they were equal in their reception of it. So while these people found and badgered Jesus are expecting daily manna from themselves, Jesus is trying to expand their understanding of what God can provide. Yes, we did the bread thing on the ground every day for 40 years, but there's more, you know? The bread being offered to them is even more miraculous than the manna of Exodus, because the bread is God's own self. The one who came from above, just like manna. The one who surprised all who encountered him. What's that? Jesus of Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Just like manna. The one who was available to all equally, just like manna. But unlike manna, this bread will never rot, will not disappear with the sun, and will sustain them all past just one day. This bread will meet their deepest hunger, and meet it in a way that provides for more than just one day at a time, but eternally. And unlike manna, God provides for more than just Israel now. This heavenly manna, this bread from heaven, is for the whole world now. Like Jesus said earlier to Nicodemus, this bread is for whosoever believeth. Jesus still physically feeds people like God did in the desert, but Jesus is also now offering spiritual food, an eternal gift that it turns out we're not really sure how to receive. It is an undeniable part of our call as Christians and as church to feed people, to clothe them, to give them water, to help them rest, to advocate for them. But we have to remember that there's eternal bread at the foundation of all of this. We are more than a food bank. We are more than a clothes closet. We are more than a place to receive toiletries from, even though those are good. There are nonprofits that do social services better than us, more effectively than us. There are charities that provide healthier and more complete meals than us, but what sets us apart from those is that we can feed people eternal bread. We have consumed and taken part in and received gladly that which sustains us beyond all other sources, and it is not just for us. In times of grave injustice like these, we are sustained and formed by the bread of life, which is justice. In these times of virulent hate, we are sustained and formed by the bread of life, which is love. In times of grasping greed like these, we are sustained and formed by the bread of life, which is economic inequality. And when we are filled by this eternal bread, we are not spiritually hungry anymore, and we are no longer vulnerable to corruption and grasping power brokers who seek to lure us into compromise if we will only say the emperor is wearing clothes. When we are filled by the eternal bread, we are not spiritually hungry anymore. We are no longer vulnerable to the enemy-hating, despair-peddling sirens who seek to lure us into violence with their song. When we are filled with eternal bread, we are not spiritually hungry anymore. We are no longer vulnerable to the stubborn grudge holders who seek to lure us away from paths of forgiveness and grace. So why wouldn't we who are filled offer that bread to others? We are called to see not only that the world is filled with literally hungry people, but it's filled with spiritually hungry people who keep gobbling up fetid and corrupt meals that the powers of evil have placed in front of them and called them good. If there is anything we are qualified to do, it is to offer up better meals, better food, better bread, eternal bread, which transforms all of us more into the image of God. So we're called to fill bellies like Jesus did, to take our meager belongings and turn them into abundance for the sake of our neighbors, but we are also called to offer up Jesus himself, who fills up our souls and brings in the kingdom itself.